I think we should start. Alexis, welcome to our webinar. We are very happy and very honored to have you here. I've been, as you know very well, been trying for about a couple of years to get together, but the universe has decided otherwise. So we hope we meet in Porto in our roundtable about what is maritime history. I first met you as a book, okay, reading pages of your book, which I enjoyed enormously. And since then, I decided to do that. Socrati, you must know, you know. So Alexis Wick is assistant professor at Koch University, and he has graduated his BA from Yale University in history, and then at University of Paris 2 in his maîtrise and master's degrees at Columbia University, and he graduated in 2010 from Columbia University, his thesis. He's written a number of articles and other works, and he's going to talk to us about his latest book on the Red Sea. So, Alexis Wick, we are here for you. You have a great audience of mature here scholars, but also a very good audience of PhD students from IMS and University of Crete and various other universities in Greece.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Hadlaftis, for the kind introduction, and of course, for your interest in my work and for your invitation. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I want to thank the organizers, Professor Hadlaftis, of course, first and foremost, and Professor Petmesas, and everyone at the Institute for Mediterranean Studies at Retimno for the organization of this event and for the invitation to present my work in this very stimulating seminar. There are, I think, few better locations on Earth to think and talk about the sea and history than here between Crete and Istanbul, albeit virtually. So thank you very much. My presentation today is entitled The Other Mediterranean, or the Mediterranean's Other, the Red Sea in History. Thank you everyone for coming also, and I very much look forward to your questions and comments to the conversation. For a long time, the human sciences were seen to flow down from inland to the shore where they stopped. History was thus bounded by a founding parameter, territory, a naturalized land-based entity whose constituents were personified by the state. In this conception, whereby territory equal people, equal politics equals the state, history was concerned with recording the activities of the states contained in their archives, which represented a people which were enclosed within a territory, itself regulated by the law, and thus the circle was complete. In recent years, however, historical studies focused on bodies of water have proliferated, usually under the broad label of the new thalassology, an appealing combination of classical authority, Hellenic authority, and radical novelty. Here, it seemed, finally, there was a providential way out of the historian's existential dilemma after the critique of modernization theory and its spatial paradigms. This oceanic turn appeared to its practitioners to point towards the promised land of scholarly renewal. The ultimate inspiration, of course, was the early work of the great French historian Fernand Braudel. His thesis, then first book, entitled The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II. From the very title of this watershed book, Braudel reversed the conventional distribution of roles in traditional historiography, so that a geographical space, neither a territorial nor a political unit, becomes the primary actor and subject of the study, with the human, the greatest emperor of his time, or so he thought, relegated to the end position, tasked with providing the context for the main subject of the book, the Mediterranean. The content of this book, Braudel organized into 3 volumes, according to different levels of time, temporality. First, the famous longue durée, basically immobile history, anchored in geological time. Second, conjoncture. It's in the middle range, a social time articulated by commercial flows and institutional developments. And only in the third and final volume does Braudel narrate the world of political events, which he and his acolytes from the Annales school disparaged as l'histoire événementielle. My project, a logical, but as you will see, critical spin-off from the oceanic turn, as it has also been termed, emerged from a startling realization. There simply is no historical account of the Red Sea that is even remotely comparable to Fernand Braudel's Mediterranean. And this, even as many other maritime basins were treated following the Braudellian model. The Atlantic Ocean had its historians, steered by the pioneering efforts of Bernard Bailyn. And so did the Indian Ocean, with the great K.N. Chaudhry, an avowed disciple of the French master at the helm. Even the massive Pacific, the elusive Baltic, and the dark Black Sea were elected to the Noble Academy of Historical Subjects. But nobody had raised properly the idea of the history of the Red Sea. And yet, the Red Sea offered itself as the ideal unitary space in terms of geographical, climatic, religious, linguistic, social, commercial, human, even political and juridical integration of a sort Mediterraneanists could only dream about. Not only were the natural and cultural commonalities of the various shores evident, it had been essentially an Ottoman lake for about 4 centuries. A caveat here. This is not to say that affairs and events relating to the Red Sea in Ottoman times do not appear in historical accounts. Of course they do, as witnessed by the great works of Halil İnalcık, Cengiz Orhonlu, Salih Özbaran, Idris Bostan, Michel Tucherer, André Raymond, Palmyra Brummett, and Giancarlo Casale, to name just a few. Rather, the concern that triggered my initial project is with the formulation of the Red Sea as a coherent subject of and for Ottoman history, an effort that was palpably not previously undertaken. In other words, though there is a pervasive incitement in the discipline, in history departments nowadays, there's an incitement to adopt thalassocentric approaches in the writing of history, there has not been a history of the Ottoman Red Sea written. In my book, I address this conundrum frontally by notably exploring the conceptual history of the sea and what I discovered to be its central place in major works of modern Western thought. Here, the German philosopher Hegel in particular features prominently. In parallel, I also mobilized my research in the Ottoman archives and in the Ottoman and Arab narrative corpus to suggest possible alternative ways of seeing and being in the world. I would be happy to discuss these matters further, but what I want to present to you today is a Braudellian-inspired portrait of the Red Sea as it emerges from various studies. My talk will be divided into three main parts, paralleling somewhat Braudel's approach, beginning with geography writ large, followed by socioeconomic dimensions, and ending with a narrative implantment of events. All three levels joining together to evoke the Red Sea as a coherent subject and a historical actor. A final section in conclusion will then gesture towards the possibility of carrying the critique even further in an attempt to listen to the past in a more understanding manner so that we may engage in a genuine dialogue with it. So part one, the geological factor. The Red Sea as a space on the ridge. The Red Sea is a long and narrow body of water oriented northwest-southeast that separates Africa from the Arabian Peninsula and connects the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. Almost completely enclosed, its length runs for 2,000 kilometers, while averaging 280 kilometers in width. Its only exit point, until the Suez Canal, that is, of course, only exit point is in the south, at the Gate of Lamentation, Bab al-Mandab, whose barely 30 kilometers are further constricted by the presence of islands. Though intimately connected to its surrounding regions, the Red Sea is a unique and coherent environment. The entire region lies along a major rift complex, which conditions the topography of the Red Sea world, characterized by the deep trough along its central axis, flanked by a shallow coastal shelf. This shelf is perhaps the most distinctive feature of these waters, for it is brimming with coral reefs. On land, it is followed by a thin coastal plain fenced by the dramatic uplift of the mountain ranges that dominate the length of the entire sea. On all sides, the coast suddenly ascends along steep, rocky mountains, separating that world, the Red Sea world, from the lands further afield. The Sinai Peninsula in the north, almost in its entirety, is formed by rugged mountains reaching an altitude of over 2,600 meters at the top of Mount Catherine. Along the eastern shore, the coast abuts the Sarawat mountain range that runs from today's Jordan to the Gulf of Aden, cutting off the sea from the oasis-spotted desert and the lush plateaus. The altitude of this mountain range, the altitudes of the mountains in this range vary considerably, reaching over 2,500 meters in the north and over 3,600 meters high near the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. But everywhere along the coast, the mountains fall abruptly towards the sea. Indeed, the very word Hijaz, which refers to this region or part of this region, the word Hijaz evokes this topographic aspect. It means barrier in Arabic, and it is indeed a mountainous barrier that cuts the Red Sea world from the world beyond. In striking symmetry, to the eastern coast, that is, the Red Sea hills of Egypt, Sudan, and Eritrea run almost continuously along the western shore, leading up to the beginnings of the highlands of Ethiopia, where altitudes rise highest in the region at over 4,500 meters. The geological substratum also conditions another dominant characteristic of the Red Sea, its arid climate. The name Tihama, the Arabic term for the length of the western seaboard, the Tihama is the name of the coast, basically, comes from a root meaning intensity of heat and stillness of air, aridity. Its surrounding shores are thus unreceptive to agricultural production due to high aridity and elevated temperatures. Rainfall is sparse and irregular, and there are no significant coastal rivers. The Red Sea world is thus also defined by its natural hostility to human settlement. This distinctive climatic factor concerns not only the land, but also the very waters themselves, which are unusually warm and saline. The southern extensions are much better watered, though neither the rains of the Ethiopian highland nor the showers associated with the Indian Ocean monsoon reach the Red Sea. They break instead along the surrounding mountains that I evoked above. These features significantly impact life in and on the sea, with its uniquely rich palette of bioecological features and fierce, unpredictable currents, resulting in serious navigational challenges. The abundance of corals caused incessant worries to pilots and provides another important feature to any portrait of the Red Sea. The concentration of such treacherous underwater protruding formations gives it perhaps the greatest concentration of reefs in the world. The coral of the Red Sea has always been one of its distinguishing characteristics. Today, it appeals mainly to lovers of its underwater world, of which I am. But it was once a crucial feature of the local architecture, from the structures of the ancient port city of Berenike to the Ottoman era buildings of Sawakin and other coastal towns, which integrated the corals into the architecture. The corals of the Red Sea served as material for construction, but they were also a significant source of income through trade over enormous distances. It should not come as a surprise then that its coral reefs have been associated with the sea's name. The standard dictionaries of Ottoman language, for example, list Shab Denizi, literally the Sea of Corals, as a common name for this maritime space. And indeed, the great 17th century traveler, Evliya Çelebi, who passed through the region, also uses this term. Besides reefs, there was the problem of the capricious currents. The two are intimately connected, and not only because they feature as prime tormentors of seafarers, they also have a common origin in the geological conditions of the region. The high temperature and salinity of the waters provide an ideal setting for the nurture of various species of corals, just as they provoke differentials of density that lead to erratic underwater flux, those currents. The violent and impulsive winds were the most spectacular threat to ships sailing the Red Sea. These would regularly, although unpredictably, sweep through the narrow waterways that had to be navigated between the many reefs, islands, and coasts. This theme recurs ubiquitously in Ottoman documents involving navigation in the Red Sea, often evoking the destruction of ships due to the force of the winds, in almost a formulaic expression. Shiddeti rüzgardan şikest olan sefine. A ship destroyed by the force of the winds. The general wind patterns were well known for millennia, and they modeled the navigation of the sea in the first place, determining sailing seasons, paces, and even the disposition of ports. But there were also more variable and intense winds that could not be mapped in either time or space. One regular feature of the wind regime, however, and no doubt the most important, splits the sea into two roughly equal navigational zones. The northern portion, governed by a peculiar wind regime, which arranged the naval shuttle between Suez and Jeddah on a cyclical basis. The southern parts of the sea, by contrast, were subject to wind patterns resulting from the monsoon seasons. Ships from beyond Bab el-Mandab were therefore unlikely to pursue their travels north of Jeddah for mere fear of missing the return winds, the monsoon of the Indian Ocean, that is. And this leads us to part two, the human factor, a place in the middle. From its earliest appearances in the documentary record, the Red Sea has featured as a liminal zone, a place in between. The very same conditions that made life and movement on the sea difficult also dictated the need for incessant navigation in the first place. Despite the inhospitable natural conditions, there were all around the coast and throughout the ages important cities. Commercial, first and foremost, but also political, symbolic, and theological, with, of course, the twin holy cities of Mecca and Medina, not very far from the coast. No city on the Red Sea could survive in autarky, and most were unsustainable in isolation from the sea itself, since the primary purveyors of vital necessities were the agricultural lands along the Nile, most importantly. As the great 15th century navigator Ahmad ibn Majid writes in his famous Kitab al-Fawaid, quote, "The Sea of Kulzum al-Arab is the most dangerous of all the seas of the world, and yet people use it more than all the seas of the world because of the ancient house and the pilgrimage of the Prophet, and because of the requirements of subsistence, of provision." There is clear evidence that this had already been the case in antiquity. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea mentions the export of grain from the ancient emporium of Berenike to ports on all sides of the Red Sea. Perhaps the most conspicuous material dearth in this nautical environment was the absence anywhere nearby of a source of adequate timber for the construction of boats. An elaborate network of transmaritime and transcontinental exchanges thus existed to make possible the very crossing of the sea. At the core of the Red Sea, as a historical actor, thus lay a tense paradox. Because of its strategic, commercial, and cultural importance, it had to have a certain population at various points along the shore. Yet, the sea or the shores are thoroughly inhospitable. It absolutely had to be navigated. Yet, for the same geological reasons, navigation of its waters was full of dangers. And given the absence of trees, it could not produce ships in sufficient quantities and at an adequate speed. In terms of human settlement, the fate of the port cities along the shore was always uncertain. The flow of traffic through the Red Sea over the centuries never ceased. But there is a striking variation over time in routes and ports along the way. Aden, Muha, Hudayda, Luhayya, Jeddah, Ayla, At-Tur, Qulzum, Suez, Qusayr, Aydab, Sawakin, Dahlak, Musawwa, all of these and many more were at some point or another major centers of local, regional, and international trade. Some of them remain as mere ruins. Others saw their fortunes rise and fall, and sometimes even rise again. Only Jeddah demonstrates an unusual longevity, due no doubt to its central location between the disparate wind regimes of the sea that I evoked above, and as obviously a gateway to the noble sanctuaries of the Hijaz. In this inhospitable context, two key transformative developments for human interactions around the Red Sea world were the domestication of the camel, which facilitated mobility and exchange along its arid shores, and the rise in the quote-unquote spice trade writ large. Both of these age-old features would continue to form a characteristic trait of the area until well into the 20th century. Indeed, from prehistoric until postmodern times, the Red Sea has been one of the most important and navigated sea lanes in the world. There are local and transregional reasons for this. And first among these is the production of unique commodities along its shores. Most famously incense and myrrh in antiquity, and coffee under the Ottomans. But there was also a significant presence of mineral wealth of various kinds. Another reason for this is its role as a hyphen between the worlds of the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. And finally, and yet again, there is a location near the coast of the two holiest cities in Islam, pilgrimage to which is incumbent as a spiritual duty on every capable Muslim. The rhythm of mobility and exchange in the Red Sea world was thus subjected to a triple cosmic metronome, as the French historian Michel Tucherer once put it. One metronome followed the sun and the agricultural cycles of the harvesting and processing of the various crops in the region and beyond. Another abided by the major wind patterns that allowed for this mobility and this exchange across the Red Sea. And yet another metronome obeyed the moon and the correct time for the pilgrimage. Though the specific peoples and goods concerned evolved over time, as did the particular ports and the markets, The basic structure of trade and transportation follow a strikingly similar pattern throughout. From ancient Egyptian travels to the land of Punt for frankincense and myrrh, to the Mamluk retail in pepper, and on to the Ottoman commerce in Yemeni coffee and Indian goods. A constant feature of the Red Sea world in the long term was its role as a hub for the exchange of commodities that were small and light, but of great value at terminus. And it is this spectacular trade, combining glamour and riches with the exotic and the mysterious, that has captured the imagination of visitors, administrators, and rulers from the earliest sources onwards. The mortuary temple of Hatshepsut at El-Deir el-Bahri, across the river from Luxor, clearly depicts a maritime expedition on the waters of the Red Sea, reaching for the land of Punt, from which Egypt had been importing numerous goods, notably myrrh and incense, for centuries already. In the Bible too, the southern end of the Red Sea, the land of Sheba, is repeatedly associated with myrrh and frankincense, and exchanges in these commodities between the various regions involved are mentioned quite often. In the New Testament, frankincense and myrrh appear most famously, perhaps, as 2 out of the 3 gifts offered to the newborn Jesus by the 3 kings. The Anabasis of Alexander by Arrian recounts the great conquests of the youthful Macedonian, and in Book 7, chapter 20, speaks of a project that he entertained of conquering the land of the Arabs, attracted by what he had heard of the natural wealth of this country, where, quote, people obtained cassia from the lakes and myrrh and frankincense from the trees. Cinnamon was cut from the shrubs, and meadows produced spikenard without any cultivation. Commercially even more important than myrrh and incense, perhaps, was the transoceanic trade in condiments, especially but not exclusively pepper, which derived primarily from age-old zones of production in the eastern parts of the Indian Ocean. Archaeological evidence indicates that pepper was reaching Mediterranean ports from at least the 2nd millennium BC. The particular centrality of the Red Sea derives in part from its location. The entire southern half, as I mentioned above, is an integral part of the major global highway constituted by the monsoon, which permitted an enormous span of the world's inhabited spaces to be integrally connected, so that from very early on, one could go back and forth across the entire stretch of the Indian Ocean within a single calendrical year. Numerous travel accounts, such as the famous one in the Arabic corpus by Abu Zayd al-Sirafi in the 10th century, relate with great detail the zones of production of the various spices involved in this trade. Despite the glamour, the most common and cumulatively high-value merchandise consisted of the more banal items of everyday necessity: cloths, ceramics, grain, and the like. Cotton, especially, primarily produced in India, but also in Egypt, and consumed avidly throughout the world, features prominently in any discussion of Red Sea trade networks, as do foodstuffs, of course. A further remark needs to be made concerning the commercial flows in and through the Red Sea. One unmistakable feature of the structure of the transit trade is the flow of bullion eastwards. This does not necessarily indicate a balance of trade deficit, as many historians have shown, for this bullion may have had multiple uses and was itself differentially commoditized. Still, one cannot fail to note this characteristic of interregional exchanges over the centuries. a feature so startling that Tucherer speaks of, quote, a constant hemorrhage of cash from the Mediterranean in the direction of India and the Far East, end quote. The merchants operating this trade are remarkably diverse in cultural, religious, linguistic, and social background over the ages. The ships used were also of numerous types, and though it is clear that most of the material necessary for shipbuilding was imported into the Red Sea region from more fertile lands beyond it, it is equally incontestable that ships were constructed in local shipyards along the Red Sea coast. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of the boats of the Red Sea until the early modern period, let's say, was that they were sewn together by cords and fibers with no use of metal whatsoever. Although one remain may indicate the possible use of iron nails in the northern Red Sea before the arrival of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, the overwhelming evidence points to the ubiquitous construction of metal-free crafts stitched with natural cords. And now, part 3, narrative emplotment. The Red Sea was probably one of the earliest seas to be navigated. And by the time the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea was written by an unnamed but clearly practiced traveler, the area was fairly integrated into well-trodden networks of exchange, so that in the period of late antiquity, regional powers sought to appropriate the wealth and strategic assets associated with the sea. Even further, the expansion of both Judaism and Christianity in the region at this time must be understood as part of these larger dynamics of mobility and exchange. Contacts were intensifying within the region and all along the Eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. It is within this gravitational field of a nascent world system, an archipelago of world cities, in the felicitous expression of Janet Abou-Lorod, who is speaking of a later period, but it's still a nice formulation. It's in this archipelago of world cities that Muhammad ibn Abdullah would be born and eventually oversee the launching of the venture of Islam, to borrow another famous formulation. The pre-Islamic and early Islamic history of the Hijaz is quite simply unintelligible if abstracted from the Red Sea world of which it formed an integral part. So are the strikingly rapid conquests that followed the consolidation of the Islamic polity in the peninsula, if one ignores the many pre-existing networks of which the Red Sea was a crucial hub. The importance of wider flows in the rapid expansion of the new religion is attested by massive evidence from the travels of some early Muslims, the famous first hijrah to Abyssinia, for example, and to the speedy foundation of a number of new ports around the Red Sea. The reopening of the ancient canal linking the Red Sea to the Nile by the new Muslim governor of Egypt, Amr ibn al-As, was part of the effort to strengthen the integration of the sea, soon dominated along the extent of its shores by the nascent caliphate. Under the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties, the Red Sea world witnessed further integration, especially since the new order maintained great symbolic investment in the Hijaz as the destination of a growing pilgrimage traffic, often maritime. There is also evidence of increased mining on the surrounding shores, and certainly of the maintenance of trans-maritime eastern trade from the Mediterranean to the Pacific Ocean. The last third of the 10th century constitutes a significant watershed for the region, as the Fatimid dynasty conquered Egypt from the Abbasids and ruled it as an autonomous entity. Not Egypt in the modern nation state sense, but that region around the Red Sea world, in fact. Though this configuration was undoubtedly present before, this configuration being a broad administrative unit with the Red Sea at its heart, it was consolidated by the Fatimids and bequeathed to all subsequent rulers, culminating in the emergence in the 13th century of the Mamluk Sultanate based in Cairo, and of the Rasulid dynasty on the other side of the sea in Aden. Throughout, the implication of the social and political elites in regional trade emerges clearly in the historical sources. And it is incontestable that the sea played a crucial role in the economic, diplomatic, and symbolic structures of the various states that ruled its shores. Another enduring legacy from the period was the establishment of large pious foundations, awqaf, the products and revenues of which were earmarked explicitly for the sustenance of the population of the Hijaz. This was especially true in Egypt under the Mamluks, and the inhabitants of the Hijaz were almost entirely provided for through these pious foundations. And this was inherited as a practice by the Ottomans after the Mamluks. For indeed, following in the footsteps of their Mamluk predecessors, the armies of Sultan Selim I, known as Yavuz the Grim, Selim the Grim, his armies conquered the lands surrounding the entire Red Sea in a highly deliberate strategic move. The Mamluks had been consolidating their control over the area for the preceding century or so. And the focus on the region only gained pace as the Portuguese suddenly erupted into the Indian Ocean world. The Ottomans, or some Ottomans, let's say, had been present in the Red Sea ports well before the formal annexation of the region. There had been indeed an extensive network of Rumi or Ottoman emigres, as Giancarlo Casale calls them, across the ocean, all the way to India. The fleet that the Mamluk Sultan was building in Suez to confront the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean was largely financed by Ottoman benefaction and manned by Ottoman subjects. The commander of the fleet that departed Suez in 1515 to counter the Portuguese was none other than Salman Reis, who would subsequently play a major part in Ottoman policy around the Indian Ocean. Salman Reis's fleet was at sea when news arrived of the Ottoman routing of the Mamluks at the Battle of Marjdabiq. He thus returned with his fleet to Jeddah, where he declared allegiance to Sultan Selim the Grim and successfully defended the city, Jeddah that is, from a Portuguese attack in the spring of 1517. For the Ottomans then, controlling that area was a first step in the assumption of their new position in a changed nomos of the earth, which resulted from the beginning of the conquest of the Americas by the Iberians and the penetration of the Portuguese into the world of the Indian Ocean, along with the rise of the Safavid and Mughal powers. Thereafter, from 1517 onwards, almost all of the lands surrounding the Red Sea were in effect to remain within the Ottoman fold for 4 centuries, after which the region, along with the rest of the empire, transmuted into the nation states recognizable today. The sole and only partial exception is the case of Yemen. There, the Imam of Sana'a succeeded by the second quarter of the 17th century in extending his authority all the way down to most of the coast until the second quarter of the 19th century, when the Ottoman state again gradually took control over all of southern Arabia. The firmness and the extent of the Ottoman presence obviously varied depending on period and area. In some zones, it did not reach as far inland as elsewhere, but the Red Sea was clearly an Ottoman lake. Concerning this historic moment, a well-known document remains in the archive of the Topkapi Palace. It is a remarkably suggestive report attributed to Salman Reis on the Ottoman garrison in Jeddah and on the new global situation resulting from the presence of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. What is interesting for the sake of the present argument is that the report envisioned the area of the Red Sea extended into the Gulf of Aden as a fairly coherent geostrategic entity that should be treated as such by Ottoman state policy. The text follows the coasts of the sea, decrying the state of anarchy and oppression because of tyrannical rulers, both Muslim and non-Muslim, and urging the intervention of the Sublime Porte. It is also explicit on the potential financial returns. Not only does it describe a number of resources of the various lands, but it also complains of the Portuguese monopolization of the spice trade, which in the past had accrued to the province of Egypt. The Ottomans did indeed send a number of naval expeditions into the Indian Ocean, which became for the subsequent decades the site of a drawn-out maritime world war. They never succeeded in forcing the Portuguese out of the Indian Ocean arena, but neither did the Portuguese manage to roll the Ottomans back in the Red Sea, so that in the end, a modus vivendi imposed itself. It is important to repeat here that the arrival of the Europeans in the Indian Ocean did not fundamentally disrupt the age-old dynamism of the Red Sea as an integrated space of exchange, even in the case of the spice trade. Only with the installation in subsequent centuries of the Dutch and the English and their successful attempt to control the zones of production of the spices themselves were the patterns of trade affected significantly. And the all-maritime route around the Cape began to take the lion's share of the imports of spices into Europe. Still, as André Raymond has demonstrated, though the exports to Europe by way of the Red Sea certainly decreased, these formed only a small part of the commercial dynamics of this region. And the continuation of the trade by way of the Red Sea had much to do with the opening of the vast internal market of the Ottoman space, the new administrative framework that extended across enormous terrains. Moreover, the trade in coffee, grown in Yemen, practically a Yemeni monopoly for a few centuries, had witnessed a tremendous boom in the 16th and 17th centuries and contributed significantly to the wealth of the Red Sea structures of trade. Over the course of throughout the 18th century and even beyond, these tendencies remain in evidence, even though coffee, as in the case of spices before, would eventually penetrate the Ottoman market from Europe and its colonies too. It is then in this context, and in light of this long-term destiny of the Red Sea that I have sketched for you above, that the regional policies of the ambitious local strongman and Ottoman governor of Egypt, Mehmet Ali Pasha, must be read in the first half of the 19th century. Like many before him, he too sought to project his power over the contours of the Red Sea as a whole. These conditions and their accompanying events led to rivalries over the Red Sea arena, involving a multiplicity of actors, including, crucially, the East India Company. Indeed, Bombay and the British took advantage of anxieties concerning Egyptian expansionism to take control of the strategic port of Aden in today's Yemen, which dominates the entrance to the Red Sea and would operate as a crucial coaling station for steamers on the route to India. This, it turned out, was the prelude to the swan song of the Red Sea world. Though, of course, many of the dynamics described here continued in one way or another, well beyond the date of the seizure of Aden by the British. And they continue indeed to this very day in some form. The British settlement of Aden, followed by the mechanization of sea travel, the opening of the Suez Canal, and eventually the occupation of Egypt by the British in 1882 would radically transform the structures and flows in and around the Red Sea. And now to my conclusion. For an epistemology of composition, we have here seen a dynamic Ottoman Red Sea, well grounded in the longue durée and the short durée, juxtaposed paradoxically with its scholarly marginalization as a historical subject. This tension leads one to reflect on the very organizing category itself. Because, as my research has shown, the very idea of the sovereign sea is a concept of recent constitution, but with an increasingly weighty discursive baggage. My lengthy research in the extensive Ottoman records in Istanbul revealed the complete absence in Ottoman documents before the 19th century of the category Red Sea. Nowhere was there the use of that term or any evidence of the historical presence of that internal Ottoman lake as a unified subject. In none of the documents examined in search of remnants that could be used as evidence in the reconstitution of its past existence did the term Red Sea make an appearance, or its concept for that. None until the age of European hegemony. After that, the term Kızıldeniz or Bahri Ahmer or Al-Bahr al-Ahmar become ubiquitous in Turkish and Arabic alike. The most common designation to appear in Ottoman documents for portions of the maritime domains that are now identified as the Red Sea was Bahri Suez, named after the port city through which Ottoman power was projected. Such a simple observation may not, at first glance, seem to be of great importance. I want to suggest that it is, and that this apparently simple semantic shift necessitates the reassessment of basic assumptions regarding philosophy, political economy, cartography, geography, and of course, history. By honing in on the present absence of the Red Sea from the scholarly arena, despite the powerful natural and historical coherence unveiled above, one is led to a set of fundamental questions concerning historical practice in general. What are the discursive procedures that enable an object to become a viable subject for history? How do particular subjects qualify as historical? How did the sea, its past and its present, become a subject of historical analysis in and of itself? And most importantly, for whom and by whom does the becoming historical of the sea materialize? Should there be, can there be a universal history of the sea? Or are there rather a series of deep-rooted, though well-hidden predispositions in the modern discipline of history that explain the absence of an integrated history of the Red Sea, even as they reveal how Europe produced the hegemonic history and geography of the universal present. In this sense, my investigation makes Ottoman and Arab history meet decolonial thought. The unexpected result is that one may very well find inspiration in the Ottoman past for ethical quests in the present. But that is a different story, and I thank you very much for bearing with me and for your attention. I look forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you very much, Alexis, for this very interesting lecture and presentation. And thank you for, you've got an excellent way to speak. So I think that our Greek participants have understood you very well. That's another problem sometimes from foreign speakers. So
I wish I could do it in Greek, but
yeah, that's all right.
in another life, inshallah.
So, well, I have many questions, but and I would like our participants to formulate questions, because we have here a large number of PhD students that deal with the sea. Okay, now, but until they get the courage to do this, I think I want you to tell us. Oh, there is Nikos. Okay. Okay, Nico. This is a student. He's a mature student, but he's a student.
Thank you, Alexis. It was.
We're all students. Sorry. Buyurun, Nikos.
I'm mature around the edges. In the middle, I'm really young. So it's very compelling. Even your ability in the speech is very surprisingly fresh, I would say. It's it breaks away from I am beginning to see a tradition of sort of rather plain historical presentations. They lack this kind of wit, which I found a lot in Braudel myself. So I have two rather technical questions. The one is, can you see a pattern in the winds in the Red Sea? Is there like say from north to the south in spring or in summer, and then that reversing? We see that in the Mediterranean. I am dealing with the Ionian Sea in my research, so we do see a pattern there of the prevailing winds. And that is the one question. And the second is, why do we have an explanation why they did not use any metal parts in the shipbuilding in the Red Sea? Is there like absence of iron ore mines, or I don't know, is there another explanation that you came across? Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos, for the questions. These are excellent. Yes, there are very distinct wind patterns, though divided between the northern part of the Red Sea and the southern part of the Red Sea. But in both cases, you could, somewhat similar, I guess, to other places, including the Mediterranean, you could do the shuttle at one part of the year. You go from Suez to Jeddah very easily. The rest of the other part of the year, you go the other way around. Same thing, and much more crucially and importantly, in the southern part of the Red Sea, you didn't want to miss. So you'd come along the monsoon winds along 3 or 4 months of the year or 6 months of the year, and you most importantly did not want to miss the return winds that would allow you to go back across the ocean or across to somewhere along the ocean in the other direction. And the patterns have been known for a very, very long time, actually. in fact, the very word monsoon comes from the Arabic mosim, which literally means a season. So it's literally the season of those wind patterns. And in the southern part, they're very regular and very well known and practiced from time immemorial. As for the question of the use of metal is, there's no definitive, I think, answer, like many historical questions. One is, I think the best way to think about it is, why not? It worked that way. Why the need for the question? Actually, it worked obviously so well for so long that I think the question didn't necessarily pose itself to the actors involved. One answer that's off, or one possibility that I think is part of the story, but to be taken with a grain of salt, is that the Indian Ocean travel, and this was true throughout the Indian Ocean, by the way, or throughout the western part of the Indian Ocean, at least, where boats were mainly fastened with cord rather than metal, is that the Indian Ocean was, or became, much more militarized and later on, with the arrival of the Portuguese and subsequent to the arrival of the Portuguese. And this led to a significant need for change in the armature of the boats, and the introduction, therefore, of a different structure, including metal, that was more, perhaps more useful in the context of more highly militarized maritime encounters. But I can't give you, I mean, I don't think there's a definitive answer of why. I think the most competent answer and most convincing answer to me has always been, why not? There is an abundant availability and practice of building boats without metal that worked very well for the conditions.
Thank you. As if I'm allowed another small question also, while you were answering that second part of my question, is I thought of the change of the shape of the ships that happened in the Mediterranean, exactly, I mean, roughly about the same time as you mentioned, when what they call the round ships come into the Mediterranean, so they stop having this sort of elongated shape. Is that maybe a factor there? Do we see that kind of transition from sort of local design to more Northern European?
The answer is no.
Okay.
Sorry, Alexis, for this.
Sorry?
I said the answer is no. I said, but you can answer yourself.
Yeah, no. There's, I mean, the eruption of the Portuguese does lead to transformations of some patterns, no doubt, of shipbuilding, and the Portuguese weren't alone. Of course, the Ottomans have an important role to play in this story too, but the local production of the crafts are continue and endure and maintain themselves into the 21st century.
Yeah,
and most of the.
Yeah, it was impossible for brigs, for example, to go through Red Sea, because it is with the reefs and everything. They had to have very light ships. So the ships of the Arab seas were very were ideal for the Red Sea. And I think that this has not been so much, although Postulus is not here, but it's not so much studied. A lot of the craft of the Eastern Mediterranean has a lot in common with the craft of the Red Sea and the Arab Seas. Yeah, so Tom.
Thanks, Jelena. Thanks, Alexis, for your lecture and for your book, which I find a very impressive piece of work, and I like it very much. My question is going to go to the natural environment side of things. A number of recent scientific studies of sea temperatures of the Red Sea over the recent past have come to almost every study has come to these two conclusions. One is that climate change is having a profound impact on the Red Sea. The second is that the Red Sea is the most sensitive sea in the world to variations in temperature. And of course, temperature influences wind currents, water currents, coral formation. As we know, coral is very sensitive to seawater temperature changes. So I'm wondering what impact, for example, the late medieval warming period had on the sea, because you're covering mostly the period of the Little Ice Age. So what impact then so you're studying it during the Little Ice Age. So, and there's also variations. So what impact then, how do we study change over time? Because all the framework you laid out about the winds, the currents, et cetera, all of that is very contingent. So I'm wondering how you get to grips with that. And I was going to suggest, if you see in the document, you can look at a couple of other proxy measures you might want to look for environmental change of the sea. I know that for other parts of the empire, we have tax lists that list species of fish that were taxed in the market. And the species of fish being caught can give you an indication of what's going on in the sea itself, right? Because sea temperature changes will impact plankton, for example, which then impacts the entire food chain. And you will see a difference in the fish species being caught. So I'm just wondering, again, my bigger question is, how are you coming to grips with change over time with the Red Sea? And to what extent, perhaps, the moment that you're focusing in on is a rather unique one, the configuration of, I assume that and again, it's an assumption because nobody studied it, I'm assuming that the Little Ice Age actually was beneficial to the Red Sea. But that's an assumption. So anyways, how are you dealing with change over time?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Well, frankly, the answer is I don't sufficiently. And in part because the work has, like you said, has not been done. So much of what we're relying upon is grounded in assumptions of, as you're saying, the Little Ice Age having a beneficial and leading to a more accommodating, perhaps, environment. And certainly the Red Sea is extraordinarily sensitive, or at least so we believe. You're absolutely right. So we think today, extraordinarily sensitive, as elsewhere perhaps, but even more precisely because of its particular conditions to climate change. So the answer is I don't know in any empirical depth. The idea of tax records on fish is a wonderful one. I'm not sure they exist for the Ottoman or Mamluk periods, at least in terms of along the Red Sea. But inevitably, that's a question that has to be addressed and is central. That said, so thank you for the question. That's a really spot on and crucial, especially considering the contemporary conditions that we live under, and that the Red Sea lives under in particular. And I think that, that's an absolutely crucial ethical, even beyond the methodological question. That said, I think the Red Sea also lives off of, or the patterns of trade and life that I've attempted to sketch here, insisting almost to the point of parody on the long-term trends and the enduring structures, involves much wider networks than only those relying on the Red Sea waters themselves. And in that sense, perhaps allow for a longer, a less kind of abrupt cause and effect between the changes in the natural environment and the social impact of it. The endurance of Jeddah is an example of that, I think.
Just two quick follow-ups. One is that we have a working group here studying, working on the natural environment of the Eastern Mediterranean over the last 500 years. And one of our partners is from Scripps Oceanographic, and he's compiling a bibliography of all the scientific studies that have been done on the Red Sea. And I'll be glad to pass that reading list on to you.
Oh, please, that would be wonderful.
The reason why I'm bringing the environmental is so important. So you've assumed in your talk, in the book, that settlement abandonment along the coast was due to economic factors. Well, those economic factors might have been environmental ones.
Absolutely. I was thinking just that.
Change in ports became then no longer important. Desertification from the other side. So you got to tease out these other factors.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I was thinking of that as I was formulating or attempting to formulate a response. And that's absolutely correct. I mean, there must be something other than simple economic factors or commercial factors to the extraordinary transformations of the port layouts and the lived urban settings along the Red Sea, and surely environmental factors have a say in that. So thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Alexis. I think before anybody else comes in, I want to ask my questions. Well, a few of my questions. One of the things I want, I think will be very interested to our audience as well as you implied this at the end, but one of the main arguments you put in your book is how Europeans connect Europe with the sea, whereas the Ottoman Empire not, okay? And you use Hegel extensively on that and his argumentation about Europe and the sea and so on, and how, we think that the Ottoman Empire has nothing to do with the sea, an empire that was in many seas. So I just want you to comment a little bit on that, a little bit more. And also, if I may, can you identify, apart from Jeddah, that grew in the 20th century mainly, but also 19th century, maritime centers in the various phases of the history of the Black Sea, of the early modern history, that is. And every sea has its seafaring people. You didn't say anything about Yemen and Hadramaut and so on. These are I think the seafarers. And where did they build the ships? They must have, were there some centers that they built the ships? Have you identified that? And the last one is, we don't have time here to discuss about this, but your question, which I also wanted to make to you again, how does the sea become an object of historical analysis, and what does it offer? You know, you talked about thalassocentric and so on, which I have very much doubted how historians have used the dress, the disguise of thalassocentrism, but it's not. You have Charles King, Black Sea, and he has these very thalasso titles, but he talks extremely little to nothing about the sea and its sea trade and so on, which you have given away of how you describe a sea in your today's lecture. And I like that very much. But just if you can comment on those 3 points.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions once again. Absolutely pertinent to what I was trying to do today. So first and foremost, yes, a large part of my argument in the book and in other works and research that I've done it concerns precisely what it is that, or the genealogy, let's say, of this this history of this, or of the sea as a concept, and a genealogy that I think is important to the directions that the historiography has taken, and in that sense, perhaps it connects to your third cluster of questions. And that genealogy I discovered, even though we think of Braudel as the great initiator or prophet of thalassology, and the first to suggest the Mediterranean as a coherent space, the first to take the Mediterranean as a central historical actor, and certainly he insisted on that himself at various points. And this is not at all to contest the greatness of the master, by the way. Let me record that very clearly from the beginning. But what I discovered reading backwards from Braudel, if you want, is that the sea actually features prominently in a much longer and much deeper and much more expansive tradition of modern European thought, let's say, and indeed that it connects very neatly with the professionalization of the historical discipline itself in the early 19th century. And here the figures of Hegel, as you suggested, features prominently, but also the figures of Leopold von Ranke, who's associated with the institutionalization of history as a proper discipline, and Karl Ritter, even perhaps more importantly, who is associated with the institutionalization of geography as a proper discipline. All three of them, but Hegel, of course, that's who he was, more than everyone, theorizes this principle to an incredible degree. And for him, in his lectures on the philosophy of history, the sea, and of course, by which he means first and foremost the Mediterranean, though he, in typical fashion, turns that into a kind of more theoretical principle. The sea features is at the heart of history for Hegel himself. And connected to that, it's at the heart of what makes Europe properly European. And there's even a sentence somewhere I quoted in my book where he says, only is properly European the European state that has a maritime dimension or is connected to the sea or something like that. And for Hegel, it's both, of course, It has both objective and subjective dimensions, if you want. It's both a feature, and this he derives directly from Karl Ritter, his colleague at the University of Berlin, that the European continent is particularly constituted in its relationship to the sea. If you take, and there's various formulas according to which this is articulated, most commonly the ratio of coastline to landmass kind of thing. It's highest in Europe, and therefore this was the peculiar feature of the European continent that made it special or different. Of course, the more pertinent question is what makes Europe a continent, which was not a question that either Ritter or Hegel posed, obviously, or Ranke for that matter. But so there's both physical dimensions, and of course for Hegel, this translates as it did for Ritter, and I think this is a legacy that continues and endures in the aftermath of these early 19th century thinkers. It had a philosophical or even theological principle almost, existential, I mean, whatever you want to call it, which not only was Europe particularly defined by its relationship to the sea and composed as such geographically, but this was also the relationship with the sea was what made European people so special and so different. It was the outward turn, the expansion towards the infinite, towards the horizon. He has very lyrical, Hegel has very lyrical phrases to that effect. By contrast, and this is what made Europe so particularly historical as a continent. This is where history happened. Progress takes place in Europe, etc. By contrast, non-Europeans were defined, so Hegel demonstrated, or thought he had demonstrated, by a reluctance to engage with the sea and a fear of the sea almost, and by a particular attachment to land. And this was particularly powerful among Asian peoples, or Asia as a geographical principle. And this was connected to the idea of Asia being the land, or the Orient or whatever, being the land of the arbitrary, the tyranny, despotism, etc., and servitude by attachment to land, as opposed to the freedom associated with going out to sea. And I think that has bequeathed a particular parameters to both European history in its association with its maritime dimension, and Ottoman history and historiography, which has, with some exceptions, which I mentioned in the talk and which I duly and gratefully acknowledge, which has tended to think of the Ottoman Empire as particularly agrarian, particularly landlocked, particularly closed off from the sea. And my premise is, of course, that no historical evidence shows this to be the case. And indeed, the Ottoman Empire, I think very explicitly and particularly, and not only in the Red Sea, but across the areas that it governed, was particularly oriented towards major, let's say, waterways. Coasts, maritime coasts, obviously most of the Mediterranean was Ottoman, of course, for much of its early modern history. Also, similarly with the Black Sea, and of course the Red Sea. But waterways, not only in terms of seas in the sense of the Mediterranean as the sovereign subject, but waterways in the sense of the connection in particular between, which is what we were talking about with Socrates at before the talk, this connection between land, seawater and rivers, which I think was absolutely crucial to determining the Ottoman Empire as a geographical space. That's a long-winded response, but I think so. That's kind of the direction from which I departed and I began, and I think is important. And I thank you for bringing this up, because I think it's very important to keep that in mind, because despite repeated critiques, the paradigm, I think, endures, and for no reasonable historical data, let's say, or doesn't correspond to reasonable historical data in that sense, at least. And I'm happy to discuss it further with, if needed. And of course, in the specific case of the Ottoman historiography, but this is true across the world. I think it's not unique to the Ottomans, but of course it was inflected along any number of parameters, beginning with racial ones. The Turks are landlubbers as opposed to seafaring people. Islam is a landlocked religion and particularly suitable for land, not sea. Provisionism as a paradigm of the Ottoman economic mind led it to privilege land and agrarian control over regional trade, for example, or etc. And I think all of them can be rebutted or rendered much more complicated, and certainly not warrant a clear-cut distinction between the seagoing Europeans and the landlocked non-Europeans. Yemen and Hadramaut, yes, absolutely. I mean, this is the most, in many ways, the most interesting and the most populous, and also in sheer numbers of the Red Sea areas, excluding the Nile region, if you want, and there are terrifically seafaring people, for sure, from time immemorial, crisscrossing the Indian Ocean from Indonesia to Egypt, with Hadramoti families, especially in later centuries, establishing themselves all along the coasts of the Indian Ocean. Boats were very clearly, and all indication shows that ships were built in local shipyards throughout the ages. And in Yemen in particular, in Aden, there was a long-standing and important concentration of shipping that brought in multiple networks from again, a remarkably diverse and trans-oceanic networks of investors, but also of traders, because the material was not available on site. So that's part of what I was trying to evoke. Suez in the Ottoman era is a very important shipyard throughout. That said, once again, it relies on extraordinarily complicated and extended networks of exchange, because they do not have the timber, or they do not have the necessary material on site to build these ships. So the Ottomans, in order to build a ship in Suez, rely on remarkable pattern, routes of exchange, bringing in the Black Sea and the Balkans into a network leading to building a ship in Suez. And many of the documents then say, if you can't build it at Suez, just buy an Indian ship that are available there, because clearly that was also a possibility, and that happened quite a lot too. Now, what was meant by an Indian ship is not necessarily clear, but I think it does indicate one that was built not on site, obviously. And finally, so Hadramotis are absolutely crucial in the Red Sea, but well beyond. Finally, I agree entirely with you. A lot of the current trend of focusing on bodies of water do not pay sufficient attention to the sea itself and to the space itself, and it's unfortunate, I think, in the that perhaps a diversion between thalassology and maritime history that ought to be much more intimately integrated.
Thank you. Socrates, the last question.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex. It was extremely interesting. I would have two questions. One, to go back to onomatology. I mean, I was surprised that there was no term for the Red Sea. And you said that the north was Bahri Suez, the Sea of Suez. So should I understand that the Ottomans didn't try to name liquid bodies, but more or less looked from the port outwards? I mean, do we have in the Mediterranean a notion of Mediterranean, or is it simply, I don't know, the sea of this or of that port? That would be my first question. And the second question is, if I understand well, there are no virtual bridges from east to west. I mean, you have a vertical sea, but no horizontal bridges that would be passages or routes of invasion, maybe. I mean, Lombard talked about Indonesia as being much more, a space between islands that are never homogeneous, just parts of islands linked together around the sea. So is it that we have two different shores that do not communicate, or that are communicate only when it's extremely necessary? Or do we have networks, trade diasporas, something that would link if Abyssinia to the Arab Peninsula or Sudan to? So I don't know the answer, but I mean, because actually Braudel talked very much about peninsulas, mountains, while the way, I haven't read your book, unfortunately, but the way I have listened to your talk is as if it was really, really a very narrow strip of land around the Red Sea. But thank you very much. It was really, I'm looking forward to reading your book. That's excellent. And about Hegel.
Thank you for questions. Also, absolutely spot on and pertinent. And I thank you for the opportunity to make myself, or to talk some more about things that I like. The Ottoman naming practices, this is a crucial argument that I should like to put forward, and that I try to make in the book, is that yes, it is not innocent, or it's not just a random element, but that it does speak to a different conceptualization of space. One in which there is no notion of the what I call the sovereign sea, or the entirety of the sea as an immaculate conception, let's say, but one in which space is always articulated through mediators, port cities, people, lands, connecting the sea to land in a sense, in the way that, and I think that speaks to what we were talking about before the talk too. So there is no word for Mediterranean I mean, there is, but equally common to Bahri Safid, or the White Sea, which is what the Mediterranean is often referred to in Ottoman, as it is in Arabic, in fact. There were numerous names of the sort, the Roman Bahri Rumi, or Bahr al-Sham, the Syrian Sea, or the Roman Sea, or the Sea of Beirut, or the Sea of Alexandria, so always naming, and this in the Red Sea is very common in the Ottoman period, where the sea is connected to the name of the sea is connected, goes through, let's say, even though, of course, the Ottomans were imperial and had an imperial gaze, and it was from afar and from above. And the choice of Suez is crucial, of course, because that's the most important Ottoman port city and garrison, militarized port city in the region on the Red Sea, of course. So it's not innocent that they would most often refer to it through, or that part of the sea through the port city of Suez. But it's very common. There's a Sea of Mecca, a Sea of the Hejaz, a Sea of Suez, a Sea of Yemen. These are all multiple seas that coexist in the space that we call the Red Sea today. In the second half of the 19th century and beyond, of course, all of these different seas tend to disappear from the record, replaced by this flattening, two-dimensional kind of map type sea, names of the Red Sea, Kizil Deniz or Bahri Ahmer. And I think that is significant, and that's what I was trying to evoke. I think it does speak to us until today in ways that compel us to think of seas through people and places, as opposed to on a two-dimensional map that you can plan on your imperial desk kind of thing. As for the second question, I insisted, I guess, perhaps too much on the vertical axis of the sea, the connection between, let's say, Jeddah and Aden and beyond, and the connection between Jeddah and Suez. But this should not, and these were extremely important axes, obviously, for all of the reasons that I evoked. Most importantly, the connection for the Ottomans, the connection between Suez and Jeddah, for symbolic reasons and political reasons, was absolutely crucial. As was the connection between Yemen and Egypt for the coffee trade, for example. But throughout the history of the Red Sea, there are very clear and evident connections, horizontal connections too, and that is incontestable. And the sea is so narrow that you could almost swim across, and this is evident throughout the ages, including times when the opposite coast was claimed to the sovereignty by a sovereign on the other side of the coast, if you see what I mean. So the Rasulid sultans would claim the Abyssinian coast of what's today Eritrea or Southern Sudan as their own, and that connection is constant and continues to this day, of course, with migratory routes that are very intense across many of these bridges, as you mentioned them. Crucially, as I said, the Hijazi coast depended almost entirely on the African coast for survival. And so all of the accounts throughout the ages indicate that there's a constant traffic across the sea, and not just the major ones that we know from Suez to Jeddah, for example, but constant traffic across the sea of foodstuffs that allows for the maintenance of the populations on the Arabian side.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Alexis. I don't see any other questions, but we will wait for you next year, hopefully, in IMS, and we can have a long discussion on these wonderful issues. But hopefully we will meet in Porto and talk about what is, about various how to approach maritime history. Thank you very, very much.
With pleasure.
Thank you very, very much. You brought up many issues and very interesting, a lot of inspirational things. So we'll meet again. Tom, you wanted to talk? No, you just clapped. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So thank you, Alexis. And,
thank you.
And very happy.
Thank you, Zelina. Thank you, Socrates. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah.
Here. Take good care. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.